Hello, and welcome to the Hudson Institute. It's a pleasure to have you here with us for this important discussion of Iran's nuclear program and the latest IAEA safeguard reports and the Board of Governors meeting and the ongoing negotiations. We are joined by two of the world's leading experts in these issues, David Albright of The Good ISIS and author of the recent widely acclaimed Iran's Perilous Pursuit of Nuclear Weapons, which was based in part on unique access that he and his team had to the Iran Nuclear Archive in Israel. We're also really honored to be joined by Oli Heinonen. Oli is really one of the world's leading experts in nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation. He was the #2 at the IAEA itself and in charge of inspections and other elements. He remains highly involved in these issues at the Stimson Center, where he's a distinguished fellow. And of course, I'm sure remains in contact with many of the players involved in this discussion and follows very closely matters involving the NPT and the JCPOA and the IAEA. And so we're very grateful to have you both with us this morning. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Oli, maybe I'll start with you since we just came off of this recent IAEA Board of Governors meeting. I think the folks who are watching probably know that there's a quarterly meeting and that, in February, there was some discussion of pressing forward on Iran with some new answers in various places. And since that period, there's been recordings and monitoring in Iran, but the IAEA has not accessed that monitoring. And so, I'm wondering if you can tell us kind of what, I think Grossi described it as flying blind a little bit. So how do you marry up what's happening with the reports and what are we seeing there at the moment?
First of all, let's think first, what is the strength of the IAEA? The strength of the IAEA is access to the sites, access to the people, access to the information. And if you restrict that, IAEA is less effective. And this is what we see here with the restrictions imposed by Iran currently to the IAEA on-site verification activities. And how we fly blind. IAEA has a lot of equipment on these nuclear installations. And actually many of them are nothing to do with the JCPOA. They are IAEA equipment which is installed under the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. And this is done all over the world, not just in Iran. Those are cameras which run and record what happens in the absence of the inspectors. There are electronic seals which record whether they are on or off. There are some equipment, measuring equipment like Enrichment monitor, which also runs in the absence of IAEA. There are weighing systems, so-called load cells, which measure all the time the weight of certain uranium hexafluoride cylinders. And this gives peaks of what's happening at the facility 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. They are now recording, hopefully, but IAEA doesn't know whether they work properly, whether there is a broken equipment, sometimes equipment fails. There may be movements which are unusual, but IAEA doesn't see them until very end of this period when they go there and see the records. If they see something unusual, they can't really verify it anymore because the item is gone. It was there in the camera view, but it's gone. So at the very end, what we may have in front of us are gaps in knowledge. And some of the gaps would be very difficult to fill. And I think that's why is his concern. And this all then comes to the major factor of the IAEA safeguards, timely conclusion. Timeliness is lost here because now we have had soon 3 months flying blind. And then when you make a conclusion, it will be partial, but for sure it is not timely. So that is his concern when he tells about flying blind.
So, building on that, David, I would note, first of all, that in a positive vein, I guess, the G7 statement was very clear in its expectation that Iran will cooperate with the IAEA investigation that came out last week. They want full transparency in these things. I thought that was a good thing. At least the Iranians reacted very badly to it. Rouhani came out and said, we can increase from 60% any day, anytime. Well, so let's just take in what Oli said about we're not exactly sure what's totally happening with the fact that they are already enriching to 60%, which I believe is enough to go into a bomb itself. I mean, you want to go to 90, I think, but it's dangerous in and of itself. It's way past 3%. So they're enriching to 90%, David, and there are these current gaps. What could be happening now?
Well, I think one thing that we know is happening is the IAEA is collecting enough information that it's clear that Iran is learning how to enrich to higher levels, and in ways where it's jumping a step in a sense. At least if you think about this traditionally, of how do you go to weapon grade uranium from natural to 4 or 5% to 20% to 60% to 90%. I mean, this is the way that was done, let's say, in the old days in Pakistan. Iran's learning how to go from, let's say, 5% to 60% and jump that step of going to 20%. So it's practicing, at least in my view, practicing breakout and gaining valuable experience in how you do that. And it's irreversible experience. And I think it creates a complication for renewing the JCPOA. On the other hand, 60%, let me not say on the other hand, just 60%, as you said, can be used in a nuclear weapon. Now, highly enriched uranium is anything over 20% enriched, and by definition, that can be used in a nuclear explosive. The trouble is 90% is best because it needs the least amount of material. 60% isn't so bad. Maybe you need double the amount of material, maybe not quite double. And Iran, so far, in my own estimation, would only have about 10% of the necessary amount for a nuclear explosive. But it's inching up, and we should keep that in mind, that it is making nuclear explosive material now, and that amount will increase. The other thing I want to point out is that it's doing this in one cascade of what they call the IR6 centrifuges. So we know they don't work perfectly by any means, but they seem to work well enough to produce a small but steady output of 60% material using the 5% material as the feed. And what if they used 2? What if they used 4? So if they had just 4 running, then they could get enough 60% material in about 4 months. So again, they're demonstrating that, at least to me, that they're increasing their ability to break out. Ultimately, I think they want weapon grade uranium, but breaking out to make nuclear explosive material.
Well, one of the interesting things is just, again, to your point, the volume of material that they seem to be accumulating at every level, but also, the number of sites where they've been doing this work over the period of time, that I think still remain uninspected. And so the concern about the gap and what they're doing when we don't see it in one place, it seems to me it extends to some of these other locations as well. So Ollie, where in these places where Grossi wants to go back and they've found traces of unenriched uranium, and the book, the book talked about, sorry, just one thing, the book talked about a weapons design that the Iranians had that was indigenous to them, 55 centimeters and could fit on the missile and these things. When you found, Ollie, were you surprised by that at all?
Well, not really, because, we got the first whiff of this program in somewhere 2003, 2004, with a very accurate technical information on some of the experiments which they were doing. So it was known to the IAEA, and in 2005 we accessed parsing and tried to find something from the former Physics Research Center. And in August 2005, we first time officially raised with Iranians this nuclear weapons-related activities when Mr. Larijani took the office. So it's been going on and gradually increasing. So there is nothing surprising for me. The only thing which worries me a little bit is that this is not yet the full picture. there are certain activities which took place after Ahmad, like was for construction of Fordo. This was started at the Ahmad, but then went to so-called Fordo project. But there were some other activities which also took place. And I don't think that we have got the bottom of those. And those include also other nuclear material related sites. So therefore, it's important for this attempt of Mr. Grossi to find the reasons why the uranium particles are there, and also particles which have been through enrichment process. And where are those equipment and which kind of experiments were done and where?
And how, I mean, again, how do you look at the volume of sites which we now know about that we weren't really fully aware of in 2015 when the deal was struck, including, you know, the several 9 or so connected to the Ahmad program and the 15 or so many other sites, test areas, workshops, and other things that are also known now, but, you know, according to some members of the IAEA, you know, fall below the threshold because no one has found any active enriched uranium there. How do you bridge that gap? I mean, how do we get visibility?
First of all, regarding the latter remark that nobody has found any recent activities, have anyone looked for that? I don't think so, because the IAEA is now stuck with these first findings, and it has to go through that process. But it's a big mistake, and I think it's a right to do, and Grossi has to push it. But one has to change the game now. This is the last time. And it's not to go tick those 20 plus places and go one by one. It will take a decade the way Iran plays it. We should go back to the arrangements of late 2003, when the Iranians were pushed to give a complete declaration of their nuclear program. And they did very, very narrow one, and certainly Ahmad was excluded. But that dossier was maybe half a dozen pages, actually equally long as was the first declaration of Iraq under 687. So they have to make a new declaration, put everything on this Ahmad and other projects, other sites together to one dossier. And then the IAEA will have a meeting with them, with the principal investigators being present, go through that document, identify the consistencies, inconsistencies, and compare it to the information which IAEA has. It should not be driven only by IAEA findings from this Ahmad project. It has to start from this open way, and then they have report this one so that the Board of Governors can follow all the time that Iran is complying with this. And this will provide the security not only for the IAEA that it does its job, but for the regional partners who are worried when they see what is taking place in Iran.
Yeah, and it would, I presume, would strengthen the JCPOA tremendously in terms of its, you know, or whatever it deals there. David, what is your view of that idea?
Oh, it's great. I mean, the original Iraqi declaration, if I remember correctly, was about 70 or 80 pages, and by the time it was finished, when they actually decided to reveal the past nuclear weapons work, it was well over 1,500 pages. So it had gone through many revisions. So I think it's by far the best way to do it. And in it, you're going to be visiting sites and more importantly, talking to the people who were in the program. And so you get a much better understanding of what happened and in the process, a greater confidence that it's not ongoing. So doesn't eliminate the need for ongoing monitoring by any means, but it certainly provides a basis. And I think there are many sites that must be of interest now. I mean, Ali alluded to some where equipment is kept that it came from the Ahmad plant. I mean, where did all the shipping containers go that were at the Turkisabad site that were alleged to hold sensitive nuclear weapons related equipment and material? Where are those now? And so I think we have to have an open mind. Iran has hidden many things in the past, and it was only outsiders that exposed them. For us to somehow think that nothing is hidden now, I think is naive, if not a more technical level, irresponsible.
So and just talk, I mean, what I find interesting, and again, Ollie, maybe you can help me with this. You know, the sites are, sometimes the IAEA reports themselves are a little vague in that they don't name the site itself, or they mention place 1 or 2. And so, you know, it's a little hard for the layman to kind of grasp. But as you read it, what you find out is that the Iranians were manufacturing big parts of nuclear weapon, you know, uranium metal and these, you know, these other things. And we don't know where the parts are, right? We don't know where the machines are. We don't know where the stuff is.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that the part of this approach really should be 3 W's. First, what was done in Ahmad project, but you need to know also what was before Ahmad and what took place after Ahmad, and not only in Ahmad. The second thing is when this was dismantled and where are these pieces now is the third W. And only when we have this picture, we can, you know, start to conclude that has Iran complied fully with its safeguards obligation. And I give a tiny small example. There are many more. I took a few names from this Ahmad document and followed where are they today, you know, after 15 years of that. And interesting was that particularly, let's say the guys who were doing modeling of the explosions using software, they have been working with foreigners. They have had foreign scientists in Iran, or they have been chasing information. Some of it is in publications, so you find the names and locations. It doesn't mean that these foreign countries were involved anything clandestine. I know some of the scientists over there or the institutes have been looking them, but for Iran, it was a possibility to improve and maintain their technical capabilities, for example, in using certain much more advanced modeling and software, which they didn't have available at home. This is just another example.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, yeah, each of these things keeps creeping along. I mean, David, I'd like to ask you, and I'd like to ask Ollie. You know, at the moment, the administration is involved in a discussion about, I guess, trying to resume the JCPOA. But the Iranians have gone well past the limits of the JCPOA. We talk about 60%, but also in terms of installing, you know, they were never going to bring the IR2Ms out of storage. They're back. They melted down the plates that were supposed to be scrap into 20%. They're all these. So how do we get back to a baseline JCPOA, or what is it that's supposed to be being discussed? And I'm sorry, the next thing I want to get at is dispute resolution, because there's been no way to resolve any disputes. So David, go ahead.
Yeah, I think some of it's simple but controversial. They created a cascade of IR6 making 60% enriched uranium. Those centrifuges should be destroyed. They're not supposed to exist at this stage of the JCPOA. From what I understand, Iran refuses. If they aren't destroyed and they're mothballed, then you have a weaker JCPOA. In a sense, you've renegotiated the JCPOA. And so I think if you look at their experience in learning how to enrich to 60%, you can't make that go away. And so I think there has to be some compensatory acts implemented to diminish the importance of that, or in a sense, sanction it. That you learn some things that violate the JCPOA, they're not reversible, then some sanctions stay in place. Now, I have no idea if the US is thinking this way. I'd also like to add that there's a part of the JCPOA that is covers some of what we've been talking about. I mean, I've always been talking about the safeguards agreement. The JCPOA is very strict. It says that under no circumstances will Iran ever seek, develop, or acquire any nuclear weapons.
Yeah, Section T is an important question. I mean, you know,
well, there's Section T, but this is even more fundamental than Section T. Yeah. And if Iran, you know, if the IAEA is saying that, that they have serious, well, let me just read what Grossi wrote. that Iran's action seriously affects the ability of the agency, IAEA, to provide assurance of the peaceful nature of Iran's nuclear program. I mean, that's in contradiction to Iran's commitment.
Let alone, well, when possessing the archive, I mean, right in that,
well, and then throw in the archive, I mean, which is certainly a violation of that fundamental commitment of the JCPOA. So are the negotiators going to bring Iran into compliance with this fundamental commitment, peaceful use commitment in the JCPOA? I don't know if they're going to do it, but certainly they should. There was some discussion along these lines in the negotiations of the JCPOA itself that never matured. But I think it should be done now, where the JCPOA process itself should be aiding the IAEA to answer the question of how do you get a complete declaration from Iran and how do you determine that the program is peaceful, and not just reward meetings. I mean, ultimately that's what happened in 2015, is meetings were rewarded, but that you reward substance and reward Iran producing this kind of declaration and directly tie it to sanctions relief.
Oli, do you agree with that? And do you see these processes? I mean, Grossi's described them as inextricably linked, I think. What's your view there?
Yeah, first of all, you know, let's go back to the Ahmad program and these declarations. And look, the lessons learned from Iran, Iraq, South Africa, North Korea, South Korea, Taiwan. First thing to do is certainly to establish that Ahmad baseline. But there are events which have now taken place after that, which are relevant. And those have documents, but those documents are not in this Ahmad cache. Mm-hmm. So that's why we need this full picture to start with. And then when it comes to the verification, yeah, it's good perhaps to destroy those centrifuges, but again, learn from the lesson. In 2003 and before, in some cases, we controlled also all the raw materials. Now all the control is just on the centrifuge rotors, but centrifuges have 92 components. 92 components, many of them from very special material, very special make. And those are listed in dual-use equipment and single-use equipment of nuclear suppliers group. Those should be monitored in the next phase of the JCPOA until, you know, someone is satisfied with the performance of Iran in complying with all these rules. And this is what is missing from the JCPOA, which was kind of horse trading exercise with people who, many of them, frankly speaking, didn't have any inspection experience.
What about, please go ahead, David.
Quickly, what Oli and his colleagues did in 2002 to 2004, 2005 was fundamentally effective in terms of getting a handle on the centrifuge program, and I would imagine it's frustrating that the JCPOA lost so much of that, and it should be, there should be attempts to get it back, because it was a verification effort that had a high degree of success in understanding what had been a very secret program, a program that Iran vehemently denied it ever had, and then suddenly, when so caught, admitted, but still hid things. And and Oli and his colleagues were so effective in flushing out many secret parts that the Iranians were still trying to hide.
Well, this is there one thing, yeah. You see these big numbers when which IAEA is spending for inspections in Natanz and Bordeaux and Isfahan. Actually, I think it's a waste of effort, because they are sitting there and almost nothing happens. And for that nothing, they have all the instrumentation in place: cameras, seals, load cells, enrichment monitor. This huge potential should be used differently. Mm-hmm. This should be used for looking up these uncertain parts to make sure that there are no clandestine activities in place. And then have in a place a normal inspection regime with short notice, unannounced inspections when you then pop every now and then in Natanz. That would be the efficient way to do it. It will make this whole monitoring program, I'm sure, much shorter, because sooner or later Iran will comply with the requirements, as did the other parties when we had such kind of regime.
That's sort of the point, right, though, that the country itself has to begin to cooperate to some extent with that process. And our experience with the Iranians so far has not been that they've wanted to cooperate, that they continue to lie and obfuscate. So absent, one of the things I thought was concerning about the JCPOA or inside any framework that we have here is a dispute resolution. Now, one of the things that they refused is access to certain military sites, and many of the places that Ole, you're alluding to in the past and presumably in the future that we want to visit are places they're going to say, hey, no. So what is the process for the dispute resolution when, in fact, like under the JCPOA, it was basically put people in a position of either the violation had to be so substantial they wanted to be the ones to call for snapback, or nothing. And it has this delay, it's a months and months of delay before it even gets before the committee. How do you envision something that would allow you folks to get to the places you're describing, even if the Iranians aren't fully cooperative, or do they turn a new leaf?
First of all, I think that this starts unfortunately, from the plan. First, you have this full declaration, all aspects on the table. Then you make your verification plan. You do as much as you can under the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, because there is a dispute resolution process in place. Non-compliance ends up with referral to Security Council, etc. And there are also powerful tools which go well beyond the provisions of the JCPOA, like a special inspection. IAEA can use even now a special inspection if it deems it necessary. And their dispute resolution is in place. Timelines are also clear. If in certain cases, the inspected party has about 2 weeks time to provide the access. If it doesn't,
it gets sanctioned. So if that's the case, how come we're not having that? Why is that not moving forward with Iran when we now know they're giving non-credible answers to these places and things like that, right? I mean, that's where we are with the Iranians, yes?
Because we went to the negotiation type of inspection, not the real physical inspection. And this system works now based on an exchange of letters and request on information. And that's why, when we had a board meeting in March, Iran was asked to cooperate. They say they cooperate. I think the first meeting took place sometime in April. The second one about 1 month later, a couple of letters exchanged in between, and then we had a June board. So nothing really moved when you are in this kind of bureaucratic process. It should be action-oriented, inspection-oriented, and then you have a different timelines. Mm-hmm. And there are dispute resolution procedures available, provided that the IAEA uses them and board supports the secretariat. Certainly it has to.
So is that the way to break the stalemate, really? I mean, around these uninspected sites to just.
Yeah, I think so. And look, what we know about those 10 uranium enrichment sites which were under consideration and perhaps under construction when in 2010 when Mr. Ahmadinejad stated them, and soon after that it was confirmed by Mr. Salehi. Has IAEA been any of those? I don't think so. Do we know the names of those places? Maybe, maybe not. And this should be part of this big plan, or declaration, which I mentioned to. And then you go from there. You don't need to visit all of them. You see from satellite imagery some perhaps not worth of it. And this is the way you should run the process, and then and not from meeting to meeting.
David, what's your take?
I agree with Ollie, and I would add that the JCPOA negotiations and whether they succeed or is Iran going to get its way or going to give, create pressure on the IAEA not to, or let me put it this way, to pull its punches and not to go too far in its demands because it'll upset the negotiations. And I think, And in fact, the negotiation should be aiding the IAEA and creating the mechanisms to incentivize Iran to do just the things that Ollie's talking about. I mean, it'd be a dream of mine if Iran would produce a full declaration, even remotely like what Iraq did or what South Africa did. So, but that should be the goal. And that, in a sense, shows you how this whole process has worn down what should be the proper role of inspections in solving this problem.
So what is the kind of pressure that is required to get the Iranians to give that kind of declaration? I mean, what needs to be said to them to get it?
Well, it was done in 2003 by EU3. They went and agreed with Mr. Rouhani, who was then the Secretary General of the Supreme National Security Council, that there will be a declaration. And then, then certain things will happen, and then they will negotiate arrangements later with Iran, this EU3, for economy and security and other issues, which then failed. And then came the declaration about 1 month later, which was flawed. They forgot to put there, for example, these P2 centrifuges, which we found from our investigations to the AQ car network. So it was not a good declaration in that sense, but it initiated the process which we were then able to still to rescue some way, like to get much control on this centrifuge manufacturing. It was a huge job, but not that big in terms of manpower once you got it in place, Iran. So I think it can still be done today. Mm-hmm. And this should be now, if the US agrees that to go back to the JCPOA, some of it should be in the language of that agreement, that this and this will take place. And if it doesn't, then there will be a non-compliance. It may be difficult to get the Chinese and Russians to agree on that, but it should be a must. You cannot have everything on this return agreement, but there need to be binding commitments of dealing with the disputes, dealing with the whole program, and third, and importantly, and this is actually what David alluded to, the use of centrifuge R&D, building additional facilities, which we call sunset provisions. They should be done entirely differently. Now it's a kind of arithmetic equation where all this increases over the time, regardless of the performance of Iran. It should be the other way around. It should be like US does with its 1, 2, 3 agreements with nuclear cooperation agreements with other countries, that certain activities are, let's say, permitted or agreed to be taking place. And the situation is reviewed, let's say, every 5 or 10 years. And a good example of that is uranium enrichment. Such kind of clause is with South Korea. So every now and then, it's reviewed whether South Korea should have uranium enrichment or not. They are burning to have it, as we know. But until now, US has not been consented to that. And that's why we have a situation which probably is good for the nuclear situation in Korean Peninsula. So something similar should be introduced to this process. Mm-hmm. And people talk about the gold standard with Emirates. Actually, there is a provision that they can forego from this commitment and go back to the enrichment if you read the fine print. So this kind of agreement, I think, should be, or something similar should be part of the new JCPOA. And the commitment should be now, details perhaps talked later.
David?
Yeah, and people often forget that the US policy in regions of tension, and Iran lives in one, is the goal is no reprocessing, no enrichment. And Iran, in that sense, is an exception. And Ollie sketched out South Korea. The attempt is to hold them to no enrichment, no reprocessing. Done that with UAE, trying to do it with Saudi Arabia. And I think people lose sight that Iran is an exception, And it's a bad exception. And if there is going to be a stronger, longer deal, this has to be revisited. And others have brought up the idea that you create a region free of enrichment and reprocessing, that Iran would agree not to do it, and Saudi Arabia and UAE and other Gulf states would agree not to do it. And so, but this has to come up again. I mean, it's just not acceptable that Iran, that we're agreeing as a nation that Iran gets to build up a massive enrichment program while simultaneously not answering the IAEA's questions that are aimed at the heart. Is this program peaceful? And the IAEA is saying, we don't know. And Iran is not cooperating, not helping, and increasing suspicions that indeed it is not a peaceful program. That is just not acceptable for the American people to accept as a future. And I would just add in that if we're worried about what Iran is doing now, and it's scary, reduced times that are needed to make enough weapon-grade uranium for nuclear weapons. We know less about their nuclear weaponization effort, but it's pretty far along. When the JCPOA limits expire in 2030, we're going to look back today and say, boy, that wasn't so bad. In that sense, if you're scared of today, you should be terrified of 2030. And so why should we sign up to such a deal?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. You know, what value does the JCPOA provide at this point? Now, the administration seems to be wanting to recreate it as opposed to do, and they say we want longer, stronger, but they seem to be alluding to a longer, stronger after they're in the agreement. I heard one of the apparent breakdowns was that the Iranians would not agree in writing to continue the longer, stronger negotiations after they got to this part of the agreement. So, you know, what faith do we have that there's an ability to create a longer, stronger framework? And if that fails, what are we looking at? I mean, you know, is there time to pressure them with more sanctions so we can get a better deal? Is there, you know, again, the last time you had folks saying, well, you know, it's we can't maintain the international sanctions regime. It's either war or the deal. We have to do the deal. Well, the international sanctions regime seemed to remain in place even after we removed our and the UN sanctions. They haven't quite gotten there yet, although they are making dangerous progress. And the war didn't break out. So what are the scenarios we're looking at going forward? You know, instability, a better, hey, David, let's start with you, and then Oli, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think it's, if they have a deal, perhaps it'll even be weaker, and the IAEA is not able to access sites, doesn't have a complete declaration, as always outlined. I think you're going to have a very unstable situation. And I think in that instability, I think it's important for the US Congress to come in and say, look, if there isn't a longer, stronger deal, let's say in 2 years, then US sanctions snap back. I mean, it's not I don't know if this Congress would do it, but it's a reasonable strategy forward. Biden administration says we'll get a longer, stronger. Well, okay, let's put a time limit on it. If you don't have it in 2 years, US sanctions snap back under US law. And that would be a way to test this and still test it before Iran is approaching this limit, this sort of the time period when it's increasing dramatically its nuclear weapons capabilities allowed under the JCPOA.
Oli?
Yes, I agree with that. And there needs to be a binding agreements now about the negotiations and additional talks to be conducted with a deadline. I fully agree on that. But this needs heavy lifting. You know, it doesn't come just by putting some additional sanctions. I think it's a naive to believe on that. You need to get the international community on board. And this is pretty much, you know, what Secretary of State and Biden administration should be doing. They should not be galloping to the deal, as they say Iran is galloping to the enrichment. But to do this heavy lifting, get the Russians and Chinese and non-aligned movement to the board, and get them to understand that it is in everyone's interest with the longer term, but not with the shorter term for some. And only then we will have something like a credible JCPOA which will work in practice. It should not be based on hope that if we now agree, everything will be nice and we can negotiate it if there is no clear deadline. Middle East doesn't work that way.
Or hope that in 10 years there'll be a new regime in Iran and nothing will matter. Well, right? I mean, that was sort of one of the premises the Obama guys floated, at least in American politics.
Look, for me, it's for the Iranian people to decide. Nobody else can teach them what kind of regime they have. Mm-hmm. They have a regime which they deserve. And that's for them to do. If they want to have some changes, certainly some people can help them. But ultimately, it is for them.
Why is there no greater outrage, Oli, at the extensive level of Iran's illicit procurement efforts that remain ongoing related to their nuclear program? And I ask this because the Germans put out extraordinarily detailed reports about the things these guys are trying to get, and there's really no other explanation.
But about the actual deliveries, not very much hard evidence. A lot of attempts. And we have to remember that these are also dual-use equipment. They don't go all necessarily to the weapons program.
But all the dual use is also promoting, right?
The is a little bit thin, and needs attention. And look what is going on. And then one has to remember one thing. Iran is improving all the time its independent capabilities. Look their missile program. Much of the equipment starts to be produced in Iran. Much of the raw materials are produced in Iran. They bring foreign expertise to Iran. We saw it in the nuclear program and it's elsewhere. So they do like any other weapons program in the past, with a time entirely independent to the degree possible.
Do you see them still cooperating with the North Koreans or others in any way?
Well, there are a lot of talks about Mr. Fakhrizadeh, who passed away or was assassinated, going there. But there are certain signs which are worrisome. And this takes us to this post-Ahmad period, and particularly on certain agreements done between the governments of Iran and North Korea. And then when you look the people involved, there were some players from the nuclear weapons program party to those agreements. So we know the guys. So the question is really to look what kind of scientific type of or exchange of views are there and what they do. And I think that the UN Security Council panel of experts has recently raised the issues related to that and mainly I think tied with the missile program, with this quite substantial transfers of money between Iran via certain countries in the Middle East to North Korea. So that there is something going on, but it needs a little bit.
There's inspection, right? There's investigation. It doesn't need
not loose talk, but focused inspection.
Right, and investigation, right? I mean, these things aren't just inspection; it's more investigation. You really need to
follow the trail, follow the money.
Yeah. Now, Dave,
just add one thing real quickly. Some people say, well, what could Iran give North Korea in terms of nuclear weapons? Based on what Iran did in the Ahmad plan, North Korea could benefit greatly from the design that Iran had for using weapon-grade uranium in a relatively compact nuclear weapon. So I think there's both sides have something to offer the other on nuclear weapons work, and that should not be overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I wanted to just quickly talk about inside the JCPOA, and we touched on it briefly, is Section T, which was largely not utilized, I think. Is that right, David?
It was. I think it's a very good section to try to get at this question of and broaden the bans implicit in the Non-Proliferation Treaty against the development of nuclear weapons and how the steps you take to do that. And it's a very good section. it was seen by some of the negotiators as unverifiable. But that's not, I don't think that's true. Obviously, if you're going to ban, let's say, computer programming of nuclear weapons codes, I mean, that's very hard to verify. But if you're limiting the use of very sophisticated equipment, that's much easier to get at. And as far as I understand, no effort was made up until 2018 to really get a handle on that, even though the IAEA had evidence of particular types of equipment that existed in Iran, and it's expensive equipment. You don't just throw it away quickly, that would be subject to Section T, and that nothing was done. I think in a reinvigorated JCPOA, that should be looked at, and Section T should be used as a way to complement what the IAEA is trying to do, which is get a complete declaration from Iran and to develop the assurance or confidence in the absence of undeclared activities and materials and facilities.
And the lack of enforcement of these things, I mean, Ali, is a political decision, right? It's not, you're right. I mean, the IAEA needs the backing of the global community, right?
Oh yeah, Secretariat needs.
The Secretariat. I mean, like, yeah,
global community is there and doesn't act.
Well, this is sort of one of my questions, which is that, what is it that, what can the IAEA do, and how important is it to the safety and security of the larger non-proliferation program around the world globally, that the countries of the world that are responsible support the IAEA in getting this full declaration from Iran? If it doesn't happen and we go forward, as David said, with some kind of agreement, what message does it send about the sanctity or the importance of the NPT itself and of the IAEA's work?
I think that the IAEA has actually a lot of power, and this action of Mr. Grossi and certain actions also of Mr. El Baradei and particularly Hans Blix in early 1990s, they alerted the international community about the problem ahead. And just look back to early 1990s, Blix, not only in the safeguards, but also before that in the nuclear safety. After the Chernobyl, he wrestled with the hands with the Gorbachev and got the IAEA to visit Chernobyl, and Russia didn't want to have any IAEA people around that time. So IAEA Secretariat has a lot of power in exposing these things. But then someone has to take the heavy lifting responsibility. And I think that the US is one of the most powerful nations in the world. So much relies on the shoulders of US and P5, also Russia and China. Those need to get on board. And I know, nuclear weapon aspects, it might be difficult to give it to international secretariat, but we were able to handle this with South Africa. We were able to handle it in Iraq. So it can be handled in a way that it doesn't proliferate any of this information outside. So I think that there is a way to do it. Section T of the JCPOA, I think it's a feel-good section. It's there, not very much specified. It has to be used in certain cases if things get sour, but that part needs to be somehow modified, perhaps in this forthcoming negotiations.
To that point, Ali, what needs to be changed in a future agreement, or that would break the stalemate of getting to some of these places, and B, get to sunset provisions or other provisions like you described, commitments of the kind that you like that are concrete, that, again, David's about not pursuing these things, and then having that where the archive itself isn't necessarily a violation. What can be done to get to those provisions to make the sunsets more meaningful for the West, but still something maybe the Iranians will deal with?
I think it is, for me, it's a full, final, complete declaration from Iran from all these aspects. Then IAEA can use much of the tools which it now has. It should not spend its time by sitting in Fordo or Natanz the way it is now done, but focus to this investigative part. And you go from there. You don't need any extra inspection rights if you are to go to verify that correctness and completeness. And don't read so much to the additional protocol. It's a 20 years old concept. It was entered in force 1987. People just don't remember. But it was negotiated after the Iraq and North Korea and at the time of South Africa experiences. And at that point in time, the IAEA Secretariat, before the additional protocol was there, was of the opinion that correctness and completeness can be verified under the Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement. Let's not forget that.
So going through that process of verification and transparency from your perspective is the absolute necessary foundation for being able to get achievable sunsets, meaningful sunsets. So, and again, this goes to the very point of kind of where some of us felt that the last set of JCPOA engagements in 2015 didn't succeed. And so maybe I'll just sharpen this point. The lack of clarity on Iran's prior military dimensions and the decision to kind of let that slide. What effect do you think, how would you articulate the effect that had on the JCPOA and led to where we are in essence today?
It took a lot of tools away from the IAEA because if we remember the 2015 report in December, IAEA said that it didn't agree that the building in Parching was the storage of chemicals. No action, just accepted. IAEA found some uranium particles, no explanation, probably same particles which we see now in other places perhaps. No action. So it took a lot of effort or tools away from the IAEA Secretariat going ahead. And it was a political decision. We heard different views from US ambassadors or Russian or others that, what this decision meant. But I think that, and David also pointed out, and you pointed out that Section T didn't show up in the IAEA reports in following a couple of years until we started perhaps to raise questions in public, and then all of a sudden it pops up without any extra explanation what the IAEA is now doing compared what it was doing in January or February or March of 2016 when it came. So I think it made a lot of bad things. And, I understand that some countries probably were not overly happy to dig deep to the weaponization because their nationals and equipment was involved. And it will expose also their secrets. It's not just that, secrets of Iran, but some of this reveal the attempts of theirs or their nuclear program to other P5 states. So I understand that, but it can be dealt with. It was possible to deal with that in Iraq and other places. So it should be doable. If not, then we will have a little bit muted IAEA also in the future.
Okay, David.
Yeah, I think there was an assumption made in the development of the JCPOA that it's the fissile material, it's the nuclear explosive material. If you can keep that out of the hands of Iran, then yes, they learned a lot about building nuclear weapons, but they won't have, in a sense, the most difficult part of building a nuclear weapon, getting the fissile material. And that's a fine view. It's a very deeply entrenched US view. I think the IAEA experience is as Ollie's outlined, is a little more sophisticated. But the problem was that JCPOA doesn't do that. And so it
doesn't cut off the fuel track, right? Is that what you're saying? When you say it doesn't do that, what do you mean? It doesn't end their fuel track?
Well, in the short term, and it is 5 or 10 years, 15 years is a short term in the Middle East. It limits their ability to produce the nuclear explosive material, and then it doesn't limit it at all. And so you don't have an agreement that's going to keep fissile material out of the hands of Iran. You have an agreement that temporarily will, with no mechanism to answer the question, how will you do that in the future? And in some ways, some of the criticism of the Biden administration is they're still not answering that question. They're not telling us, how are you going to make this a longer, stronger deal that makes it so Iran would have an extremely difficult time, or even let me just say difficult time, building nuclear weapons.
So in the last, sort of 5 minutes we've got here to wrap up, always as you look ahead here, what can be done? What should outside parties be urging to help strengthen the IAEA process and maintain the sort of no reprocessing processing standard for the U.S. side of it, but to keep alive the strength of the IAEA and keep Iran from developing nuclear weapons?
I think that this is the heavy lifting, which I have said before, that the US government, together with some other governments, preferably together with the Russians, take it and look at, raise the basic question that, do we need the IAEA? What kind of IAEA we need? And if we had a weak IAEA, what is this impact of that to the nuclear non-proliferation? And the term nuclear non-proliferation perhaps need to be rethought. What does it include? Is it just atoms of uranium, atoms of plutonium, or is it more? And I think that this is one of the things, for example, which the NPT review conference could address. Or the other way around is to make a little like, international September 11 type of, commission to look this and get experts from other countries involved and let the experts look what is needed and then give that one to the policymakers.
David, final thoughts?
I think in terms of what outsiders can do, I think one of the most important is to be insisting that the IAEA is able to do its job, and that processes are built into the JCPOA to encourage that job getting done. And it obviously the 2015 JCPOA didn't do that. It had the opposite impact, in fact. But I think in this round, that should be front and center. But I think too often people get distracted by thinking about, well, there'll be limits on centrifuges. There'll be, the breakout timeline will somehow mysteriously become 12 months again. And that somehow provides confidence, when in fact, it only provides confidence in the short term if you're unsure if the country's intending in the long term to build nuclear weapons. And so I think the public needs to demand clarity on this situation and demand that the fundamental issue be dealt with, that we want to make sure Iran doesn't build nuclear weapons. Otherwise, I think we're going to have to accept that there's going to be periodic attacks on Iran's nuclear sites, its personnel, and that we don't have any right to sit there and condemn that activity. If the United States fails in doing the job, then others are going to do things. And I think we're going to have to accept that.
Well, again, to your point, I do think that in the last period, we've seen that it's not either everything or nothing. It's not either regional war or let them do what they want. There has been this sort of, mowing of the lawn, these explosions, these other things of the last assassinations of the last many years that have slowed them down. So maybe there is a third way. I'd like to see the whole thing dealt with and no instability. But in the absence of that, suppose maybe that's just, we got to rely on our allies to take care of some of this business if we want to do it ourselves. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making time for this discussion. And I look forward to the next one. I know that there's an important discussion to be had about strengthening the NPT itself and the IAEA itself in the next period of 20, 25, 30 years we go forward. And I know that's an important conversation for us all to have. Oli, thank you again for making your time and lending us your expertise on this important issue related to Iran. David, thank you for your contributions on the book and everything you and the team have done. And I look forward to talking to you guys again very much. Any last words you want to share?
Thank you. I think that we still have a chance now, because in a certain way I see this negotiation getting delayed, and maybe it's better to get the next Iranian administration involved with that. Even though it might be hard.
Well, again, one of the things, David, you've said is there is a little time, and we ought to use it for the most effect we can. So let's see. All right, guys, thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us.